A determined young man named Joo In-gong sprinted toward his favorite game shop, proudly carrying the name everyone loved to tease him for, because he always believed he was meant to be a main character anyway. The shopkeeper handed him the brand new VR remake of the game Joo In-gong had mastered since childhood. Knight Saga, a world of humans, demons, quests, and a story he knew better than his school textbooks. Back home, he unboxed the sleek cartridge, strapped on his VR gear, and prepared for what he called a light 8-hour session. But the instant the game started, a blinding blue light exploded and sucked him straight inside. A moment later, he opened his eyes in a bed, realizing he wasn't just playing anymore. He had been dropped directly into the world of his favorite game. As he examined his body and wondered which character he had become, a voice called from outside, asking if he was still asleep. The curtains were drawn open, and an orc entered, urging him to come out quickly because they were busy today. Joo In-gong, both puzzled and amazed, stared at the orc in disbelief, muttering that the graphics looked unbelievably real, almost like actual life, which only left the orc confused. Wondering to himself if he could really converse with these NPCs, and noting that nothing like this had been shown in the game's advertisement, Joo In-gong asked the orc's name. The orc gave him a strange look and questioned why he was acting as though he had forgotten, before introducing himself as Karak. Repeating the name under his breath, Joo In-gong watched as Karak opened the door again, reminding him that everyone was waiting for him, Prince Shutra, and urging him to hurry. The title struck Joo In-gong, who recalled that Shutra was the 9th son of the Demon King, and with growing disbelief he realized he hadn't even been given the chance to select a character when he logged into the game. He raised one hand, and a status window appeared before him, displaying his stats, those of Shutra. Joo In-gong wondered if he was really forced to play as Shutra for his first run, but his thoughts froze when he saw how low the stats were. Even ordinary NPCs usually had at least 10 points in each attribute, yet these numbers were pitiful, despite Shutra supposedly being a prince. Shifting his gaze, he noticed the skills listed, one called Conquest and another labeled Protagonist Setting Adjustment. The second skill in particular caught his attention, and he couldn't help but wonder if it truly meant what he thought it did. Just then, Karak peeked through the curtain, urging the prince to come out, to which Joo In-gong reluctantly agreed. Pulling the curtain aside, he stepped outside and froze in shock. A large group of orcs stood waiting in strict formation, their posture as tense as soldiers preparing for war. Trying to make sense of it, he asked why the atmosphere felt so grim, but Karak dismissed his words, telling him to stop spouting nonsense and get moving, explaining that they had to eliminate the Scarlet Lightning bastards. The revelation left Joo In-gong stunned, and before he could react further, Karak shouted that this was their first battle and ordered them to march. Bewildered and uneasy, Joo In-gong could only think to himself how absurd it was to be thrown into a fight without even the chance to go through a tutorial. Because the Scarlet Lightning tribe had formed a military force for an uprising, Joo In-gong, now living as Shutra, was tasked with resolving the matter alongside the 7th prince and 8th princess. As they marched, he broke the silence by questioning why they were bringing only 10 people if this was supposed to be a war. Karak, looking puzzled, reminded him that he had explained yesterday it was only a patrol and asked if the prince had eaten something strange since he was acting so oddly. Joo In-gong chose not to respond and instead raised his hand to open the map, remarking how convenient it was to have a mini-map and deciding he would keep it on at all times. To his surprise, the map revealed a hidden path, and he wondered if it was connected to some kind of event. Karak, however, struggled to make sense of the map, and when Joo In-gong declared they should follow him since he knew a faster route, Karak only grew more confused. The group pressed on, climbing over rocky terrain, while Joo In-gong breathed heavily from exhaustion, realizing just how weak Level 1 felt. Eventually, they came across a mysterious door. Karak, astonished, asked how the prince had found such a place, and if he was secretly a mage, but Joo In-gong brushed it off with a short reply. Concerned, Karak then asked if he was all right since he looked so worn out. Inwardly, Joo In-gong grumbled about his poor stamina, but he still ordered Karak to check if the door would open. At that moment, a bright yellow aura burst from his body, leaving him startled. A system notification appeared, informing him that he had leveled up simply from walking. Joo In-gong could hardly believe it. His stats had risen by 2, and he even received 2 extra points, which was absurdly generous. Looking ahead with renewed determination, he heard Karak urging him to hurry. Smiling faintly, Joo In-gong replied that he was coming, thinking to himself that while he had no idea what lay beyond the door, at least he wasn't facing it alone. And more importantly, the protagonist always had plot armor. The cave was deep and dark, its walls rough and damp. Karak muttered that dwarves must have been the ones to dig it, and Joo In-gong added that he thought there weren't supposed to be any left. Karak explained that there weren't anymore, but they had once existed, though he only knew from hearsay. Curious, Joo In-gong asked if the dwarves had left the demonic realm entirely, but Karak admitted he didn't know. Just then, the group stumbled upon a mountain of treasure. The orcs cheered, shouting that they had struck gold and that the foolish dwarves must have abandoned their weapons. They hurried to gather the loot, complaining about how heavy it was, while Joo In-gong carefully observed the pile. A system message appeared, informing him that his level, strength, and magic were insufficient to properly use the equipment. Disappointed, he still muttered that he would take them anyway, and began to wonder if there was a way to store things in his inventory. Reaching out to touch an item, he willed it into his possession, and to his amazement, it vanished and reappeared inside his inventory. Realizing how it worked, he grinned, thinking that all he had to do was touch and command to take. Opening his map, however, he noticed something strange. Alarmed, he shouted at the orcs to get back, leaving them confused at his sudden outburst. In the next instant, the wall cracked apart with a thunderous explosion that sent orcs flying across the chamber. Several lay dead or unconscious, while through the smoke, a red foot emerged. From the dust stepped crimson-skinned orcs, the Scarlet Lightning tribe, led by a towering figure who introduced himself as Kai-chan, their general. With a sneer, he declared that they had known the prince and his orcs would come here, and then roared for his men to kill them all. Battle erupted in a frenzy, steel and blood colliding, screams echoing through the cavern. Standing at the back, Joo In-gong watched in shock, torn between fear and calculation, wondering if he should at least steal some kills to gain experience points. Two orcs clashed in front of Joo In-gong, and in desperation he leapt forward, striking at a red orc from behind with his sword, only for the blade to snap in half on impact. Panic surged through him as the red orc, now enraged, turned and charged straight at him. Terrified, Joo In-gong fled, but his fear only grew when he stumbled on a rock and fell face first to the ground. A system alert flashed before his eyes in crimson. Health 1/15, magic 5/5. Heart pounding, he scrambled in panic as the red orc roared and swung down its weapon. Joo In-gong curled up, screaming and covering his head, certain it was the end, until Karak intercepted, blocking the blow and shouting at the prince to get up and move before engaging the red orc himself. Trembling, Joo In-gong muttered that his hands wouldn't stop shaking, insisting to himself that this was supposed to be just a game. Gathering what courage he had left, he shouted that he didn't want to do this anymore, that this was enough for today, and quickly pulled open his system menu. A prompt appeared, asking if he wanted to return to the menu, but when he searched frantically through his status window, his fear doubled. There was no option to log out. The realization struck him like ice. He might be trapped here. Around him, the orcs continued fighting fiercely as General Kai-chan began striding toward him with a wicked grin. Raising his staff, the general unleashed a burst of magic directly at Joo In-gong. Desperate, Joo In-gong screamed that he couldn't die here, but the spell struck him full force, blasting him backward into the cave wall with crushing speed. Agonizing pain racked his body as he slid down, vision fading, barely conscious. Through his blurring sight, he saw Kai-chan rushing at him, weapon raised high. The last thing he registered was the system flashing in cold finality. Health 0/15. Joo In-gong found himself standing in a vast emptiness, surrounded by nothing but silence. Bewildered, he asked aloud where he was, certain that he had just been taken down by the orcs. Panic crept in as he wondered if this meant he was truly dead. Suddenly, a bright yellow light appeared before him, and a voice echoed through the void, declaring that Joo In-gong was the fated existence of this world, meant to conquer, enslave, and rule. At that moment, a radiant goddess emerged from the light, her beauty leaving him speechless. Meanwhile, back on the battlefield, the clash between orcs raged on, steel and roars filling the cavern. Kai-chan advanced with a confident smile, remarking that he hadn't expected the enemy to come with such a small force, wondering aloud if they were ignorant or simply foolish. Raising his voice, he ordered his subordinates not to waste time and to slaughter every last one of them. Just then, his eyes caught something unusual. Joo In-gong was still alive, his body wreathed in a brilliant yellow aura. A system notification appeared before him. Telekinesis LV.1 acquired. Startled, Joo In-gong questioned when he had even learned such a skill, only to notice something new in his status window. An inscription that read Knight of Conquest. Kai-chan, now visibly irritated, bellowed at his soldiers, demanding to know why they were hesitating and shouting for them to kill the prince immediately. Karak, alarmed by what he saw, immediately shouted for his fellow orcs to protect the prince at all costs, ordering that no harm come to him as the red orcs roared in fury and charged straight toward Joo In-gong. Gripping his broken sword tightly, Joo In-gong glanced at his status window, muttering that Knight of Conquest wasn't a class normally available among the knight branches, leaving him puzzled as to why it appeared. In that instant, he slammed his fist against the ground with all his strength, yellow sparks bursting forth, and a strange certainty filled his mind, spells and commands echoing within his head as if they had always been there. With conviction, he declared that the power of conquest was the power of a king, then raised his voice in a shout. Under the king's banner, at once, the green orcs aligned with him began to radiate a golden aura, their bodies brimming with newfound strength. A system message appeared. Conquest skill activated. Buff effects applied to allies within designated area. The orcs gasped at the sensation, shouting that they felt stronger, before charging at the red orcs with renewed vigor, vowing to sweep the enemy aside. The battlefield shifted as the empowered green orcs began to overwhelm their opponents, cutting through the red orcs with surprising ease. Watching the sudden turn of events, Kaiken's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to comprehend when his enemies had gained such strength. His gaze fixed on the prince, and suspicion crept into his expression as he wondered if this miracle was Joo In-gong's doing. Kai-chan roared at the prince, demanding that he stop immediately, but Joo In-gong remained completely unafraid. Karak intercepted Kaiken's attacks, shielding the prince, who then called out Karak's name and commanded him to go finish off the enemy general. Kai-chan froze in confusion, unsure how to respond, just as Karak swung his blade and decapitated the general. The head fell to the ground, sending the enemy orcs into a state of panic. They began fleeing, and the green orcs, empowered by Joo In-gong's conquest skill, gave chase, shouting to each other not to let a single enemy escape. A system message appeared, noting that the general's merits had been granted to his king, and multiple status windows popped up, showing that Joo In-gong had leveled up. Shocked, he wondered why his experience was increasing so quickly. Karak, staring at the prince, glanced at his own hands in disbelief, trying to comprehend the source of this newfound strength, slowly piecing together the puzzle, and suspecting that the prince might be responsible. Moments later, the scene shifted to the camp, where Joo In-gong was alone in his own base. He frantically searched for the log out button, only to find it completely gone, and forced himself to remain calm despite the rising panic. Opening his status window, he contemplated the possibilities. First, that he might be trapped in a virtual reality game due to some bug in the real world, which could potentially be fixed with the next update. And second, an idea so insane it almost made him shiver, that this was no longer a game, but reality itself. Joo In-gong muttered to himself that, just like in novels and comics, he had entered the world of a game, a world that resembled fiction, complete with NPCs who could converse back and forth, and, most importantly, no mosaic censorship, as his gaze drifted to his midsection. Panic rose as he wondered if this was truly another world, and whether he would have to die here, but he reassured himself that at least he wasn't an orc or ogre, that he was a prince, and that he had been born with a golden spoon in his mouth. At that moment, Karak opened the curtain and asked if the prince had some time, leaving Joo In-gong puzzled as he called out Karak's name. It was midnight. Joo In-gong asked why Karak suddenly wanted a sparring match, and Karak explained that, as the future leader, it was important to gauge the prince's swordsmanship to prepare for what lay ahead. Skeptical, the prince asked if it was really necessary, and Karak tossed a sword to him, assuring that he would hold back as much as he could. Smiling wryly, Joo In-gong remarked that such words seemed inappropriate when speaking to a prince, then charged at Karak, adding that if he was going to fight, he should fight seriously. Karak braced for the impact, but when the prince swung his sword, no damage was done at all. Karak stood confused, staring at how weak the prince was, before deciding to end the sparring. With a powerful swing, he sent Joo In-gong flying backward, crashing to the ground. Concerned, Karak asked if the prince was all right, and Joo In-gong groaned that Karak shouldn't hit so hard without warning. Just then, a system message popped up. Basic swordsmanship LV.1 acquired. Joo In-gong stared in disbelief, puzzled as to when he had actually acquired the skill. Joo In-gong realized something. The situation mirrored the moment he had acquired telekinesis. He wondered if he gained skills by directly experiencing attacks with his body. Karak spoke up, suggesting they end the sparring match and go eat, but the prince countered, asking who had said it was over. Karak was confused by the remark, while Joo In-gong, steady on his feet and brimming with confidence, declared that the match was just getting started. Charging at Karak, he struck, only for Karak to block the attack. Observing closely, Karak noted that the prince's movements had improved dramatically and wondered why he had been so weak at the beginning, questioning if his skills had suddenly advanced in such a short time. Launching an attack of his own, Karak saw the prince step back to steady himself, then tauntingly asked how that felt and if he wasn't doing well. Curious, the prince asked Karak his level, and Karak replied that he was level 21 the last time he checked. Repeating the number under his breath, Joo In-gong opened his status window, saw that he was level 7, and confidently thought he would catch up soon. In this world, everyone had levels, but unlike Joo In-gong, they could not see their stats immediately and had to rely on a level evaluation spell. In other words, being able to view and reinforce his stats with extra points was a huge advantage. With renewed determination, the prince leapt forward at Karak, and both delivered a strike simultaneously. Fighting intensely, Joo In-gong thought to himself that he could grow stronger and much faster than anyone else. The two continued their duel as the scene shifted elsewhere. The game, the demon arc of Knight Saga, follows the story of Zephyr and how he surpasses his siblings to become the Demon King. While it spans many episodes until the ending, the central focus remains Zephyr's rise to power, culminating in the year 517, when he kills all his siblings to achieve his goal. The keyword here, all, meant that Joo In-gong, now inhabiting Shutra, would also be a target. Since the current year was 512, Joo In-gong still had some time to prepare. He resolved that his priority must be preventing this fate, and the best way was to become stronger than Zephyr. At that moment, Karak appeared, asking the prince what he was doing there, explaining that he had been searching everywhere. Joo In-gong asked if something had happened, and Karak reminded him about today's meeting, leaving the prince puzzled. Urging him to hurry, Karak said that everyone was waiting. Later, back at the base, Karak sat, looking confused, as two unusual figures appeared before him, a woman and a blonde man. The blonde introduced himself as Chris Moonlight, the seventh prince, and jokingly asked why Karak had suddenly become polite, telling him to be comfortable since they were siblings. The woman, the eighth princess Caitlin Moonlight, pointed out that this was their first meeting, but Chris ignored her and insisted they use first names. Joo In-gong, now speaking as Shutra, agreed to Chris' request. Chris and Caitlin were the children of Elaine Moonlight, the fourth queen and ruler of the lycanthropes, and in the game, they had been just as much of a handful. However, a year before the day of the massacre, Chris and Caitlin were destined to die at the hands of Zephyr and the other children of the Demon King, the reason being the secret of Caitlin Moonlight's birth. She was a bastard daughter. At that moment, Caitlin spoke up, questioning Shutra about why he had fought the enemies without following the plan, reminding him that she had only told him to go on patrol. Panicking, Shutra protested that he hadn't known they would come from that direction. Caitlin then suggested taking a closer look at him, asking if he had been hurt anywhere, leaving Shutra even more confused. She cautioned him that he was the weakest among the siblings and should be careful, prompting Shutra to apologize. He wondered why they were concerned for him and when they had grown so close. Chris added that Shutra would be in for a real scolding if he did anything dangerous again, and Shutra obediently agreed. He couldn't help but wonder if the two were actually kind. Thinking strategically, Shutra noted that there were many aura users among the lycanthropes, perhaps due to their abundant life force, and realized that if he applied the same method he had used to acquire skills, he might be able to learn aura just as easily. Sparkling with excitement, he then asked for a favor. Chris, curious, asked what it was. Shutra boldly requested that the two hit him with aura, leaving them both shocked, exclaiming in unison, "What?" In the backdrop, the gloomy mountains loomed, where red orcs clashed with the green orcs. A massive red orc charged forward, mercilessly killing smaller red orcs, terrifying the others, and smashed the ground with such force that a violent explosion erupted. A massive red orc roared, ordering his troops to kill them all and promising a reward to whoever claimed the most kills. The green and red orcs clashed fiercely as the scene gradually faded. Meanwhile, Joo In-gong, inhabiting Shutra's body, found himself standing in a void of nothingness. A beautiful goddess appeared before him. leaving him in awe and full of questions. Three unknown figures emerged beside her, and Joo In-gong wondered who they were, realizing he did not recognize them. The goddess drew closer, a brilliant light enveloping them both, leaving Joo In-gong confused as the scene abruptly faded back to him lying in his own bed. Surprised, he sat up, questioning whether it had all been a dream. Karak suddenly appeared, startling Joo In-gong, who scolded him for the scare. Karak, however, noted that the prince seemed fine and asked why he had requested the princess to strike him, remarking that his persistent whining had led him into trouble. Karak noticed something unusual about the prince, and soon Joo In-gong began emitting a white aura. A system message appeared, notifying him that he had obtained Aura LV.1. Feeling the power coursing through his body, Joo In-gong marveled at the sensation. Karak, shocked, asked if the prince could awaken Aura by being struck with it, and Shutra replied that it was somewhat the case. Karak connected the dots, realizing this explained the prince's sudden surge of energy when fighting the Lightning Tribe, and Joo In-gong confirmed it. Curious, Shutra asked if anything had happened while he was asleep, and Karak simply replied, "Of course." Karak mentioned that the main force had also defeated the Scarlet Lightning Tribe. Shutra echoed the words in surprise, questioning, the main force? He had thought that only Chris, Caitlin, and himself had been involved in taking down the tribe. Karak asked if the prince knew the size of the tribe, and when Shutra asked who had been in charge, Karak replied, General Bandal. Hearing the name, Shutra was shocked. Bandal was one of the strongest figures around, and Joo In-gong, having played as Zephyr, had always admired him as a subordinate. Suddenly, a realization struck him. This might be his chance. Bandal would only become Zephyr's subordinate in the year 515. And since it was currently 512, Shutra still had time to recruit him first. A menacing smile spread across his face. Joo In-gong thought to himself that he already knew everything about Bandal, the rewards he preferred, the food he liked, his talents, and most importantly, that winning a duel against him was the key to bringing him onto one side. Confident in this knowledge, Joo In-gong concluded that he could secure Bandal as a subordinate before Zephyr. Grinning, he muttered that it was worth trying and that he still had plenty of time. With a dark, determined smile, he declared that Bandal would soon be Joo In-gong's subordinate. Moments later, in Caitlin's camp, a loud voice echoed as Chris and Caitlin looked on in shock, witnessing that Shutra had reached the level of aura expulsion in just one day. Shutra smiled menacingly, explaining that he had invested all his points into aura, a decision that was far from rash since aura enhanced physical capabilities in general, actually making it more useful than telekinesis. Chris, incredulous, asked if this was possible because Shutra was a Gandharv. He then asked if Shutra could create an underground map, to which Shutra paused, thinking that while he didn't have a map skill per se, he did possess a mini-map. Calmly, he requested pen and paper. Moments later, Shutra had drawn a remarkably detailed map, impressing Chris, who exclaimed that it was even more detailed than the one he had. Overwhelmed, Chris hugged Shutra, calling him a genius, while Shutra simply laughed. Caitlin chimed in, noting that since the Scarlet Lightning Tribe they had encountered was now completely defeated, their enemies would be unaware that the group had knowledge of the underground tunnels. Chris added that this meant they could set up a perfect ambush if they used the tunnels strategically. Then, with a serious expression, Chris mentioned that there was something else he needed Shutra to do, leaving Shutra curious about what it could be. In the next scene, the beautiful mountains stretched out before them as Shutra and the orcs made their way along the path. Karak spoke, asking if their mission was simply to patrol the area again, and Shutra replied that he had no choice, adding that he was currently the youngest of his siblings. Karak remarked that it was fortunate they had reinforcements, and Shutra credited Karak for all the hard work, making Karak smile in agreement. At that moment, they paused as Shutra noticed two figures ahead, Caitlin and another female figure. He called out to his sister, but Caitlin hushed him. Curious, Shutra asked about the robes, and Caitlin explained that she had been following him in secret to intervene only if things became dangerous, emphasizing that any accomplishments should be his own. Shutra thought to himself that Caitlin was being overly cautious, even calling her stupid in his mind, and awkwardly asked about his accomplishment. The other female introduced herself as Syra, the adjutant, and Shutra politely greeted her. Caitlin interrupted, assuring him that the two would keep up with him and that he had nothing to worry about, to which Shutra agreed. Later, in a deep, dark, and massive cave, they continued marching forward, their items arranged in front of them. Shutra asked why the caverns were empty, and Karak explained that anyone moving through them would have taken their valuables, assuming that the dwarves had collected everything before leaving. Shutra asked about the weapons they had acquired last time, and Karak replied that he guessed those items were not considered valuables. Shutra nodded in agreement. They continued marching when Karak suddenly warned the prince that something was approaching, and Shutra replied that he had heard it too. Checking his mini-map, Shutra spotted the enemy and opened his inventory, remembering that he had taken the flash spell item just in case something like this happened. Calmly, he instructed Karak to tell everyone to close their eyes when he gave the signal, leaving Karak confused. Suddenly, countless red eyes emerged from the darkness, and monstrous creatures called stone spiders charged toward them. Shutra shouted for everyone to close their eyes, then hurled the items high into the air. They shattered, releasing a blinding light that disoriented the spiders, which were rendered useless in the brightness since they thrived in the dark. Seizing the opportunity, Shutra commanded the orcs to attack and eliminate the monsters. The orcs charged with full confidence, swiftly cutting down the stone spiders, while Shutra observed from a distance. Opening his minimap again, he noticed that the spiders hunted in groups, each led by a larger red spider, with a big red dot on the map indicating the leader of each group. Shutra called out to Karak, instructing him to follow as they aimed for the boss, and Karak agreed. They ran through the chaos together until the leader of the stone spiders appeared, a massive, imposing creature. Karak leapt forward and delivered a powerful strike, only to be met with surprise. The attack caused no damage. The monster's interior was incredibly tough. Noticing this, Shutra thought to himself that he had forgotten. Karak's axe could not pierce its exoskeleton. He realized the monster's weakness was fire, but added that he could not use fire magic yet. The monster growled, and Karak went on high alert as it charged at them. Shutra quickly shouted for Karak to use fire, but Karak asked where he was supposed to get it. At that moment, Caitlin appeared and told Shutra to raise his sword. Following her command, Shutra lifted his blade, and to his shock, it transformed into a blazing fire sword. Caitlin asked if that would be enough, and Shutra called out to his sister. As the monster attacked, Shutra remained unfazed, locking eyes with the creature. Its strike slammed into the ground, creating a huge explosion, but Shutra dodged and charged forward, unleashing a skill called Burning Blade. The monster was engulfed in flames as Shutra watched the attack unfold. In that moment, a yellow aura emitted from his body, and a system message appeared. Shutra has leveled up. Opening his status window, he saw that he had reached level 9. Caitlin asked Shutra if he was okay and what the light had been just now. Shutra thought for a moment before answering, telling his sister that it was like a blessing, something that happened occasionally, so there was no need to worry. Caitlin inquired if it was a blessing from the Gandharv, and Shutra replied, kind of. Changing the topic, Caitlin asked if Shutra had fought these monsters before, since his responses had been remarkably skillful. Scratching the back of his head, Shutra explained that he had only read about them in books, though in truth, he had fought them many times in the game and therefore knew their behavior well. Karak then spoke up, telling the prince to look over there, leaving Shutra and Caitlin curious. Karak explained that it appeared to be some sort of door. Moments later, the door opened, revealing 4 heads inside. Shutra paused, realizing that it was a town portal. Karak asked if Shutra knew what it was, and Shutra admitted that he wasn't entirely sure but had a guess. Observing the patterns on the ground, he noticed that the design was in a dwarven style. Thinking back, Shutra recalled that when he played as Zephyr, he had never seen one, but as a hero, he had encountered them a few times. He considered that if mana were properly channeled into the pattern, it could activate. Stepping closer to the portal and facing the others, he told them he believed it might be a portal. Caitlin repeated in question, "A portal?" Cyrus spoke, noting that judging by the design, the prince seemed to be correct. Caitlin asked if they could determine where the portal was connected, and Cyrus replied that if they searched the nearby area, they should find some inscriptions. Karak then told the prince that there was something carved on the wall, and they headed over to inspect the engravings. Caitlin observed that it was clearly not written in common demon script, but resembled dwarven characters. Karak asked if Caitlin could read it, and she replied that she had no knowledge of dwarven script. She then asked Syra, who apologized, admitting she also did not know. At that moment, Shutra deciphered the writings, leaving Caitlin and Syra shocked. Shutra read aloud that the inscription said, Gishka Mountains Portal Number 2, connected to Portal Number 3. Startled, he wondered why he was able to read Dwarven. Just then, a system message appeared, informing him that he had acquired Dwarven language LV1, leaving Shutra amazed that he could learn languages in this way as well. Karak asked the prince if he could read the language, and the prince replied that he thought he could. Caitlin questioned since when Shutra could understand Dwarven, while Syra pointed out the inscription below and wanted to know what it said. Shutra examined it and explained that if one infused mana into it, it would activate. He then asked Caitlin to try injecting a little mana, but she wondered why it had to be her and not him. Flustered, Shutra claimed he was clumsy with such things, though in truth he admitted to himself that he could not use mana at all. Caitlin eventually agreed, approached the blue orb in the center of the room, and infused her mana into it. The orb shone brightly, and a holographic map appeared, revealing the Gishka Mountains. Shutra pointed to a glowing dot, explaining it was their location, and indicated that portal number 3 should be there. Karak asked if dwarven tunnels existed in that area as well, and Shutra answered that it was highly likely. Karak wondered if that was good, since the Scarlet Lightning tribe had stationed its main forces in front of those mountains, but Shutra reasoned that this made it an advantage, as they could strike from behind. He concluded that they would stop for the day and that he would discuss the matter carefully with his brother, and Karak agreed. Later, when they returned to base, Chris, full of energy, remarked that he never imagined a portal would be hidden in such a place, and praised Shutra as a blessing, though Shutra modestly insisted that he had simply been lucky. Chris told Shutra that if there was anything he wanted, he only had to say it, and as long as it was within his power, he would grant it. Shutra replied that he was fine and needed nothing, but Chris insisted, adding that as his leader and someone older, he wished to reward him, and if Shutra refused, his feelings would be hurt. After some thought, Shutra asked if it would be acceptable even if his request was somewhat unreasonable. Chris, intrigued, grew more curious, and Shutra asked if he could be taught the Beast God's first art. Chris' expression darkened at the request, and Shutra reflected inwardly that although he could not yet wield weapons properly due to his level, techniques were different. The Beast God's first art was a martial discipline handed down through the lycanthrope royal family, known simply as a powerful S-rank martial art. Shutra admitted that it was a ridiculous request and said he would understand if Chris refused, adding that it was probably too difficult anyway, and that he had expected from the start it would not be possible. Chris remained silent at first, but then suddenly declared that he would teach him. Shutra was taken aback, hardly believing what he had heard, but Chris clarified that while he could not pass down the secret techniques, he could at least teach him the aura. Shutra asked in surprise if that was true, and Chris in turn questioned whether such a gift was sufficient. When Shutra gave no reply, Chris remarked that his silence might mean he did not like it. Shutra, panicking, quickly added that the gift was perfect. Chris then called his name and, with a hint of uncertainty, asked if Shutra could think of him as a brother. Shutra repeated the word in surprise, considering its weight, and thought it was a meaningful title. He decided he was fine with it and even liked the idea. The two clasped hands, and Shutra agreed to accept being called brother. Chris and Caitlin smiled warmly, and Shutra smiled as well, thinking that from now on, the three of them would work together. At that moment, the system announced that an alliance had been established with Chris and Caitlin. The scene shifted to a breathtaking mountain landscape overlooking the Scarlet Lightning tribe's encampment, where red orcs moved restlessly across the grounds. Two rocks soared overhead while one of the orcs, grinning menacingly, stood before a prisoner and demanded to know what had brought her there. The captive was none other than the sixth princess, Felicia Doomblade. The perspective then changed once again, revealing Shutra's status window. He noted that with each increase in level, all his stats had been rising by 2, but at some point, his charisma had begun to increase by only 1. He questioned why, recalling that in the original Knight Saga, appearance and charisma had been separate attributes. Appearance determined how beautiful or handsome a character was, while charisma reflected how likable they were in the eyes of others. To him, this distinction made sense, as his overall growth pace had been good so far. More importantly, however, he realized he was about to reach level 10 soon. In Knight Saga, whenever Zephyr or Loch reached level 10, their unique skills, Descendant of Darkness and the Chosen One, would each rise by 1 level, and Shutra reasoned that if he also reached level 10, one of his own skills would surely advance as well. At that moment, Karak pulled aside the curtain, announced that everything was ready, and asked if they should depart, to which Shutra agreed. Karak, noticing his bright demeanor, remarked that the prince seemed unusually cheerful and asked if something good had happened, but Shutra replied it was nothing. The two stepped outside to where an army of orcs stood assembled, and Shutra smiled, telling them to set out. The scene shifted to the mountains where a deep cave lay hidden, and inside, orcs were locked in battle with strange monsters while a mysterious door loomed in the background. The five main figures enter the chamber, finding two creatures studying a blue orb, and Chris questioned them about their investigation. One confirmed it was complete, explaining that the portal was connected to the Eska River of the Gishga Mountains, and when Chris asked if it functioned properly, the creature assured him it did, praising the sturdiness of dwarven craftsmanship. Satisfied, Chris ordered them to move, and the orb suddenly flared to life as mana was infused, opening a portal to another location. Shutra and Karak watched in awe, barely able to believe what they were seeing, and Shutra thought he never imagined he would witness something like this in reality. As the others advanced toward the portal, Caitlin turned back and asked what he was waiting for, prompting Shutra to run after them, insisting he was coming. He quickly followed, and once on the other side, he looked beneath him in shock and realized that they had arrived directly above the enemy's base. Chris remarked that it was just as expected, the enemy's encampment, and estimated, judging by the size of the base, that it held roughly 5,000 troops. He explained that if they struck from the rear, their first priority should be the supplies, and if General Bandal launched a frontal assault to distract the enemy, their infiltration units could burn down the food stores from behind. Syra then spoke up, noting that something seemed strange, as the camp did not appear to hold nearly enough soldiers. Chris noticed it as well, admitting she was right and wondering where the rest of the enemy had gone, even considering the possibility that they had already launched an attack. At that moment, Shutra caught sight of something in the distance, figures locked in combat, and wondered who they were. Chris instructed him to focus his aura into his eyes, and when Shutra did so, he saw an army of red orcs clashing against unknown soldiers. He reported that he could now see the battle, and Caitlin observed that one side was clearly the Lightning Tribe, though she could not identify the other. Chris added that the opposition could not be General Bandal's forces, since no battle had been scheduled for that day, and the scale of the fight was far too small. Shutra, straining to see, recognized the opposing force and realized they were Dark Elves. When he said so, Caitlin asked in disbelief if that was really the case, and Shutra confirmed it, explaining that Dark Elves had smaller builds and that these particular warriors were mounted on Dracos, which left Caitlin stunned. Chris observed that the Dark Elves were retreating and wondered if their commander had fallen, noting that their withdrawal was happening at incredible speed. Karak asked what was going on and whether the battle had already ended, while Shutra also questioned inwardly why the Dark Elves were even there in the first place. Moments later, back at the base, Chris, Caitlin, and Shutra were seen conversing with General Bandal. The general, having heard about their discovery of the Dwarven portal, praised them and remarked that it was just what he expected from Prince Chris' army, before asking how they knew a portal would be there. Chris clarified that he had not been the one to find it, and that credit belonged to the ninth prince, Shutra. Embarrassed, Shutra claimed it had only been luck, though inwardly he thought it was nice to see General Bandal again. Bandal acknowledged his words, but added that this time Shutra would finally receive a proper reward at the Demon King's castle. Chris then shifted the topic, mentioning the small skirmish they had witnessed in front of the Lightning Tribe's camp, and asked if Bandal knew anything about it. The general replied that it was most likely the Dark Elves, who appeared to have joined the conflict on their own accord. Chris questioned why the Dark Elves would want to fight the Lightning Tribe, and asked if they were reinforcements from the Demon King's castle. Bandal said it was difficult to say, but explained that, according to reports, the Dark Elves had originally planned only to scout before joining up, yet something had gone wrong. He then changed the subject, warning them that they had a far greater issue to deal with, prompting Chris to ask what it was. Bandal explained that the leader of the Dark Elves' independent unit had been captured by the Scarlet Lightning Tribe, prompting Chris to ask if that reckless skirmish had been because of it. Shutra suddenly interrupted, wanting to know who the commander of that unit was, and Bandal replied that it was someone Shutra knew well, none other than the sixth princess, Felicia Doomblade, their sister. The revelation left everyone stunned. Felicia Doomblade, daughter of Sylvia Doomblade, the third queen, was not only a princess of the Dark Elves but also the twin sister of the fifth prince, Sylvan Doomblade. In the game, both Felicia and Sylvan had belonged to the faction of the fourth princess, Anastasia Necrian, which was why Joo In-gong's impression of her had always been that of an enemy. Shutra wondered why Felicia had appeared here at all, and speculated that she might be trying to interfere in order to claim merit. Chris questioned whether the Scarlet Lightning Tribe even realized that the Dark Elf they had captured was Felicia, but Bandal admitted that they had not yet been able to confirm it. Chris then asked what Bandal intended to do, and the general answered that if it was possible to rescue Felicia, they would, but when Chris asked about negotiation, Bandal replied that if the enemy made the first move, then they could talk, yet he had no intention of bowing first. Chris accepted this with a brief acknowledgement, and Bandal concluded by saying he would gather more information from his side and would contact them if anything happened, to which Chris responded with his understanding. After the discussion ended, Chris reflected on the situation and thought bitterly that their brilliant older sister had now become a prisoner. Caitlin immediately spoke up, insisting that if Felicia was still alive, they had to save her, but Chris replied that while it would be ideal, it would not be easy. He explained that attempting a rescue could result in heavy losses on their side, which left Caitlin shocked by his words. She protested firmly that they had to save Felicia regardless, as she was still their sister, but Chris, though understanding, remained hesitant. Shutra also contemplated the matter in silence. Later, within the base, the higher-ranking officers gathered in a strategy room, and Chris laid out the plan. It was straightforward. When General Bandal drew away the Scarlet Lightning Tribe's main force, they would strike the enemy encampment from behind. Chris declared that he would personally charge into the center of the base to create as much chaos as possible, while Shutra and Caitlin would each lead their own squads to carry out a separate mission. Shutra asked if that mission was to rescue their sister, and Chris confirmed it, explaining that they would first burn the enemy's food stores and armory to cripple their supplies, then move to rescue Felicia. However, he stressed that if the situation became too dangerous, they were to retreat immediately, as they could not afford to risk countless lives for Felicia alone. Caitlin was angry at what her brother had said, but Chris told her to be quiet, reminding her that he was also the commander of a unit. Caitlin insisted that Felicia was family and demanded how Chris could speak so coldly, while he explained that they could not allow Felicia's reckless actions to jeopardize the entire operation. Shutra observed the exchange with curiosity, noting that Chris did not seem particularly intent on rescuing Felicia and wondered if something had happened between the two. The scene then shifted to nightfall, with the army marching confidently and declaring they would annihilate the Scarlet Lightning Tribe. Chris and the other orcs watched from a higher vantage point, observing the enemy's base, and as they drew closer, an explosion erupted, throwing the enemy into panic. General Bandal appeared with his men, charging into the fray and commanding that all enemies be slain. Karak noted that the attack had begun, but asked why they were not moving yet. Shutra advised waiting for a signal. Meanwhile, two opposing forces clashed, with General Bandal's team gradually gaining the upper hand as Bandal assessed the situation. Suddenly, he gave the command to retreat. At that moment, Chris instructed everyone to prepare and move, emphasizing that the mission had to be carried out exactly as planned. As soon as he issued the command, the troops charged, and the enemy panicked at the sight of another attack, while Chris' forces continued to gain the advantage in the fight. At that moment, Caitlin warned Shutra to be careful, and he returned the caution in kind. Shutra then opened the map, noting many red dots representing enemies on the minimap, and shouted to his men to move left and dash straight for the food storage, which they promptly agreed to. Karak commanded the orcs under his charge to kill all enemies, and together they began overpowering the opposition. Suddenly, an enemy attempted a sneak attack, catching Karak off guard, but Shutra intervened, throwing a dagger that killed the attacker. The system immediately appeared, informing him that his dagger throwing had reached level 1, bringing a smile to his face. Karak, curious, asked the prince when he had learned to throw daggers, but Shutra downplayed it, urging everyone to move quickly while thinking to himself that he had simply tossed a dagger the night before and somehow gained the skill. Karak then shifted focus to the target ahead, pointing out what appeared to be the food storage and asking if they should set it on fire. Shutra confirmed, and they continued with the plan. However, he paused, worrying about Felicia. If she was locked inside, she could be caught in the flames and die. Quickly adjusting the plan, he told Karak they needed to find Felicia first. When Karak asked how, Shutra checked the minimap, reasoning that Felicia, as a neutral NPC, should be marked in blue or purple. Spotting a marker, he directed Karak, who followed, and Shutra made his way to the tent where Felicia was being held. He opened the curtain, thinking this must be the place, yet still wondered where she could be. In that moment, a female voice called out, and Shutra turned toward it, discovering none other than the sixth princess, Felicia Doomblade, who was tied up, and asked him what he was doing there. Felicia was taken by surprise upon seeing Shutra and questioned his presence, while he quickly worked to untie the chains binding her, insisting that they could talk later as the place was dangerous and they needed to escape immediately. In his mind, Shutra calculated that if he saved Felicia here, her indebtedness might prove useful in the future. Felicia remained astonished that he was helping her at all. Moments later, once they were both free, Shutra remarked that they had barely managed to escape and urged her to hurry and regroup with Chris and Caitlin. Felicia, still confused, was startled to hear that and asked if Chris and Caitlin had come to rescue her. Shutra affirmed it, questioning why she was asking, and wondered if rescuing her was not their original goal. Unsure of how to respond, Felicia admitted that he misunderstood her, explaining that he had been removed from the current power struggle and was unaware of the situation. At that moment, Karak shouted a warning to the prince that the enemies were swarming in. Hearing this, Shutra told Felicia to follow him quickly, and she complied. As they ran, Felicia abruptly changed the subject, questioning when Shutra had started addressing her by her first name, but Shutra ignored her and kept running, leaving her surprised by his urgency. Suddenly, Felicia noticed an attack approaching from behind and called out to warn him. But before he could react, a bright light pierced through Shutra's body, causing him to cough up blood just as a massive explosion erupted. Terrified, Felicia called out to him, staring at the explosion and desperately searching for any sign of him. In that instant, a red orc appeared behind her. She noticed it and prepared to fight, but before she could move, the orc's head exploded, leaving her stunned by what she witnessed. Felicia looked toward the source of the attack and saw a figure emerging from the smoke. As a single footstep echoed forward and the haze cleared, the figure revealed itself to be none other than Shutra, glowing with a radiant white aura. The system appeared before him, notifying that he had acquired the skill man control along with fire arrow level 1. A confident smile formed on Shutra's face as he unleashed a flurry of blazing arrows toward the enemies, each shot striking with precision and power. He relished the moment, amazed that he was wielding real magic. Even though it was only a basic level, the sensation thrilled him, and he laughed in satisfaction as the battlefield erupted with flames. Suddenly, an ice arrow shot toward him, narrowly missing and freezing the ground where it struck. Startled, Shutra turned to see an enemy orc aiming another arrow in his direction, only to realize that the arrow's true target was Felicia, who was rushing toward him, concerned for his safety. Acting instinctively, Shutra lunged forward and pushed her aside, preventing her from getting closer. Felicia was caught off guard by his sudden action. In that instant, several ice arrows hurtled toward Shutra. Rather than feeling fear, he was exhilarated, eager to let the attack strike him in hopes of gaining new abilities. The arrows struck, triggering a massive explosion that enveloped the area in thick smoke. When the haze finally cleared, Shutra was still standing, battered but alive, as the system appeared once more to announce that he had acquired Ice Arrow Level 1. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, until a sudden wave of weakness washed over him. Confused by the sensation, he staggered, then collapsed to the ground as a single arrow was revealed to have pierced clean through his body. The system appeared in red, indicating that Shutra's health had dropped to 13 out of 95. Struggling to get up, he realized he could not withstand another hit like that. At that moment, Felicia's voice rang out, scolding him in frustration, though her flushed face betrayed a mix of anger and embarrassment. She questioned why he had saved her, calling him an idiot, and pointed out that among their siblings, he had always been the weakest, implying that he was hardly in a position to rescue anyone. Shutra, confused by her words, thought to himself that Felicia was completely misunderstanding the situation. When he glanced toward the enemy orc, he was surprised to see it already dead, unsure of what had happened. Meanwhile, Felicia demanded to know when Shutra had learned magic, while Shutra silently wondered when she had defeated the enemy mage. It dawned on him then that Felicia believed he had been trying to save her. Without warning, she reached for the arrow lodged in his body and yanked it out, causing him to scream in agony. Wasting no time, Felicia cast a healing spell, enveloping him in a bright green light. The wound began to close rapidly, and Shutra, impressed by the speed of his recovery, noted inwardly that it was just as expected from the genius mage Felicia Doomblade. The system appeared once more, announcing that he had acquired heal level 1. As his body mended, Felicia, still visibly worried, asked if he felt better and whether he could stand. Shutra acknowledged that he was fine now, largely thanks to her. However, before they could rest, both noticed a large figure rushing toward them. A wild ogre was charging in their direction, and as they watched it approach, Shutra recognized it as a blood ogre, a mutated and far more dangerous species of its kind. Felicia, startled, questioned whether they needed to get past it to escape, and Shutra confirmed that they did. Within moments, the two were running as the monstrous creature closed in behind them, and Shutra couldn't help but wonder how the two of them were supposed to fight something so powerful. The blood ogre slammed its massive fist into the ground, causing a powerful shockwave that exploded through the surrounding area. Shutra and Felicia narrowly avoided the impact, diving aside just in time. Shutra, bewildered, wondered how a creature of that size could move so quickly. Felicia called out to him, instructing him to distract the monster while she prepared a powerful spell. Still uncertain about how to do that, Shutra hesitated, but another explosion shook the ground, forcing him to act. Realizing there was no time to waste, he resolved to draw the monster's attention and urged Felicia to ready her magic. Felicia, however, seemed momentarily confused by his use of the word aggro. Shutra then called for Karak, asking where he was, and upon receiving a response that he was nearby, instructed him to get ready and follow the same strategy they had used before. Karak acknowledged the plan. Shutra quickly opened his inventory, debating whether he could now wield the dwarf dagger. Summoning it into his hand, he drove the blade into the ground, causing a radiant light to burst forth as he invoked the command. The beam of light surged toward Karak, engulfing him in its glow and filling him with newfound strength. Empowered, Karak charged headlong toward the blood ogre, and the two clashed violently, their blows echoing across the battlefield. With a sudden burst of force, Karak managed to land a solid hit, enraging the creature. The blood ogre bellowed furiously and prepared to strike back, but Felicia seized the opportunity, moving swiftly behind it. Confidence radiated from her as she unleashed her spell, causing the ground beneath the ogre to destabilize. The massive creature lost its footing and crashed heavily to the ground. Without hesitation, Karak leapt high into the air, his weapon raised, and brought it down with devastating force, ending the battle in a single, powerful blow. The blood ogre spewed blood from its mouth as Karak's powerful strike connected, and Karak continued to stomp on the creature, driving it deeper into the ground while it roared in agony. From a distance, Shutra watched the scene unfold, releasing a relieved laugh as he realized they had won the battle. Though aware that other enemies still remained, he felt grateful that the most troublesome opponent had been defeated. Just as he allowed himself a moment of relief, a light began to radiate from his body once more. The system appeared before him, notifying that he had reached level 10. Shocked by the sudden advancement, Shutra barely had time to process it before another message appeared, informing him that his protagonist buff had leveled up. He smiled at the notification, pleased with the progress, when the system displayed yet another update, announcing the addition of a new passive skill as a result of protagonist buff level 2. Curious, Shutra opened the message, which revealed the new skill, Battlefield Blessing level 1. The description stated that it slightly reduced the accuracy of ranged weapons aimed at the protagonist. Observing the details, Shutra thought to himself that it resembled the so-called Stormtrooper effect, where countless projectiles would miss their mark whenever aimed at the main hero. With this new ability, he realized he could replicate that same phenomenon. However, his thoughts were interrupted when several enemy orcs came charging toward them. Felicia was seen running from the approaching foes, shouting to get his attention and urging him to act. Snapping out of his daze, Shutra quickly regained his focus, readying himself for the next wave of battle. Felicia came to a sudden stop, turned toward the oncoming enemies, and unleashed a surge of power that sent the orcs flying backward. Shutra watched in astonishment, recognizing that what she had just used resembled magic, but was clearly something different. He realized that it was the power of a spirit. As the enemies were blown away, he reflected that although dark elves were often considered corrupted, they were still elves, and before becoming an exceptional mage, Felicia had been a natural-born spirit user. While Felicia continued battling the remaining foes with effortless precision, Shutra stood nearby, smiling to himself as he wondered if he could someday harness that kind of power too, and secretly thought about what it might be like to be struck by such energy himself. A sudden burst of yellow light lit up the sky, leaving the nearby orcs staring in confusion. Karak immediately turned to the prince and asked what the signal meant, and Shutra calmly explained that a yellow flare meant everyone needed to fall back. Karak blinked at him, stunned, while Shutra wondered if something had gone wrong elsewhere and if someone might be in danger. When Karak asked for his next command, Shutra ordered him to gather the troops and retreat, adding that he himself was heading toward Caitlin. Karak panicked and insisted on following him, but Shutra shook his head and said there was a reason for the retreat, so Karak needed to obey and lead the others to safety. At that moment, Felicia stepped in and volunteered to accompany Shutra, saying she wasn't the type to leave a favor unpaid and she still had unfinished business with those filthy enemies. Karak, realizing he couldn't change their minds, sighed and told them both to be careful, promising to wait for them above. Shutra and Felicia accepted and set off. As they walked, Felicia asked if going to Caitlin was really necessary, and Shutra replied that with such a sudden retreat, it was better to check. Felicia then wondered aloud if Caitlin could possibly lose to opponents like these, and Shutra said that if she didn't, that would be perfect. They could all head back together. Felicia gave him a disappointed look and asked if he was actually worried about Caitlin, and Shutra admitted they were family, though in his mind he added that the real reason was because she was his ally. Felicia glanced at Shutra, thinking about what he had just said, while somewhere else Caitlin was wiping out the red orc monsters without breaking a sweat. She spun around, activated her magic, and blew up the orcs around her, but more kept coming. Two of them rushed her as she moved back, pulled out her magic sword, and cut them down in a single swift strike. In the distance, Felicia and Shutra watched the battle unfold, with Felicia saying it was exactly what she expected and Shutra adding that there was never anything to worry about. When Caitlin noticed Shutra, she turned and asked why he hadn't run, and after hesitating, he muttered to Felicia that he came to save her, even though she clearly didn't need saving. Caitlin was about to question him, but then she spotted Felicia standing close to Shutra and instantly dashed over to hug her, overjoyed to see her safe. Felicia, smiling, told her she worried too much, while Shutra, observing from the side, wondered how the two had gotten so close. Then he noticed something on his map and quickly warned them that enemies were heading their way again, telling them they needed to retreat. Caitlin told him to take point while she and Felicia covered the back, and he agreed. Later, in the portal room where the orcs were resting after the battle, the three walked in and looked around, and Felicia asked if Shutra was the one who discovered the portal, to which Caitlin proudly replied that he was, and that it made a major contribution to the entire operation. Felicia quietly mentioned that it felt strange because Shutra had changed so much. Right then, a voice called out that everyone had returned safely, and when the two turned around, they saw it was Chris. Caitlin quickly said she had brought Felicia back without any issues, while Felicia remained silent. Felicia then greeted Chris, saying it had been a long time, and Chris agreed with a small nod. Soon after, the four of them gathered in a room, and Chris mentioned had heard that General Vandal's troops had also won, and that Yakujan had apparently backed off the moment he saw the garrison go up in flames. Shutra, confused, asked who Yakujan was, and Caitlin reminded him that he was the great chieftain of the Red Thunder tribe. Felicia then asked if Yakujan had surrendered, and Chris replied that it wasn't really surrender. He had simply escaped, and if he managed to rally his scattered followers, the fight could start up again. Chris then said that tomorrow they would be moving against Kairam's forces, Kaiken's older brother, because it would be bad if he joined up with Yaku January. After that, Chris shifted the conversation and asked Felicia how she ended up here, and with a sad expression, she explained that she had been studying some ruins nearby when she heard news of the battle and was captured while trying to help. Chris, however, questioned whether that was really the truth, and Felicia sharply asked if he thought she was lying. The two stared at each other tensely until Chris suddenly turned away, saying Felicia must be tired and they should all get some rest. Everyone agreed, though Felicia was still lost in her own thoughts. A little later, the orcs were lounging around, eating and resting, while Shutra sat off to the side, checking through his inventory and thinking about how amazing his new skills felt, even if the only one he could actually use in a real fight was Aura. Just then, someone called his name, and when he looked over, he saw Felicia standing there. She politely asked if she could come in, and Shutra, confused, wondered why she was visiting so late. Felicia stepped closer, called his name again, and suddenly grabbed him by the front of his clothes, pulling him right toward her, leaving him completely stunned as her face ended up inches from his. With no hesitation, she told him to take off his clothes, causing Shutra to turn bright red. Stammering, he asked what she meant, only for Felicia to lean in and repeat herself, until she calmly added that she needed him to undress so she could heal him properly, leaving Shutra frozen because he had clearly taken it the wrong way. A moment later, Felicia was channeling magic over him, explaining that what she did before was just basic first aid and that he might have internal damage. So she was giving him a full healing spell this time, while Shutra silently sulked because he had been expecting something entirely different. Felicia then shifted the conversation and asked why his body glowed earlier and if something was wrong, but Shutra quickly said it wasn't a big deal and that it happened from time to time. Shutra quickly shifted the conversation and said he actually needed a favor, catching Felicia's attention. She tilted her head, wondering what he was talking about, and Shutra explained that it was something only she could help him with. Hearing that, Felicia's curiosity spiked even more, her eyes narrowing as she waited for him to continue. A moment later, several new skills popped up on Shutra's screen, and he couldn't stop grinning at the fresh abilities Head gained. Since Felicia had agreed to help him, Head managed to unlock 3 healing spells, and today was, before he could finish the thought, Caitlin walked in and announced that, as he already knew, there were many forms of Beast Fist. Shutra's eyes lit up, excited that he was finally going to learn it. Caitlin explained that for today, they would focus on the werewolf style, the core form that leads to the Beast God Fist, which made Shutra realize why she chose it. She told him that Beast Fist used both inner and outer aura, and today she would teach him how to handle his internal aura. Shutra nodded and closed his eyes as instructed, focusing deeply until he started to feel the flow of energy. Aura, the essence of life, tied closest to the soul, and when taken to its peak, becoming soul power itself. Suddenly, a bright glow surrounded him, and a system message appeared announcing he had gained a passive skill called Protagonist Physique Level 1, leaving him stunned. When he checked what it did, he realized it was insanely powerful. Another skill unlocked right after, and Shutra muttered that this was completely on the same level as Zephyr's and Loch's passives, and since it gained new traits with every level, it was basically a system that kept adding broken features as it grew. Shutra gave a confident smirk, thinking to himself that this must be what it truly felt like to be the main character, and the thought alone made him excited. Caitlin snapped at him, asking why he was spacing out and telling him to focus, and Shutra quickly apologized. She then announced that it was time to begin Beast Fist training for real, and Shutra eagerly said he was ready. A short while later, he stood in awe as the system informed him he had learned Beast Fist Level 1. Caitlin praised him, saying mastering the basics that fast was no small feat. Shutra stared at his glowing hands, amazed that even without a weapon, they felt like he was holding something lethal, and he finally understood the power of Beast Fist. Caitlin then said they should move on to the next technique, but before they could start, a soldier rushed in and called for the princess, reporting that there was an emergency. Soon after, Chris gathered the 3 of them and explained that Kyram's forces had vanished, shocking everyone. He added that it seemed Kyram had seen through their plan, and Caitlin asked what their next move should be. Chris explained that according to General Vandal's intel, Yakujan and Kyram were planning to meet at a specific point, and he pointed to the map. Shutra noted that based on the terrain, the prediction was highly accurate, and he said they should attack before the 2 forces could unite. Chris agreed and declared they would regroup with General Vandal and launch a full-scale assault on the Red Thunder Tribe with their main army. Not long after, at the main camp of the Red Thunder Tribe subjugation force, Vandal greeted Chris, saying he had traveled far to get here, and Chris replied that Vandal looked exactly the same as always and that it had been a long time. Vandal then turned to Caitlin and said it had been a while for the princess as well, asking if she had been doing all right. But Felicia cut in, saying they could catch up later and demanded to know how her subordinates were doing. Vandal assured her that everyone under her command was safe. Shutra watched them with a smile, thinking to himself that Vandal was the character he used the most back when he played Knight Saga, so even the man's stern expression felt strangely nostalgic. Shutra stepped forward to introduce himself, and Vandal paused, looked him over, then offered his hand, saying it was a pleasure to finally meet the 9th prince. In another place entirely, the goddess suddenly appeared, and as she gazed ahead, another woman stepped out, one overflowing with tremendous aura, and the 2 of them turned their attention toward Shutra, who stood frozen in shock at the sight. A mysterious message flashed before him, reading Conquest and War, leaving Shutra stunned and confused, but in the next instant he jolted awake in his bed, breathing hard and wondering if the whole thing had just been a bizarre dream. Shutra couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen the white-haired woman somewhere in a dream before, but the woman in red was completely unfamiliar, and he wondered who she was supposed to be. Just then, Karak yanked open the curtains and told him it was time to move, and Shutra replied that he was coming. As they headed out, orcs rushed around preparing for war, and Shutra reminded himself that had been assigned to the left flank for this battle. Vandal was commanding the center, while Chris and Caitlin led the right, and the Dark Elves formed a fast-moving rearguard. Soon the march began, and before Shutra realized it, he was standing on a massive battlefield with thousands gathered on both sides. Vandal roared for everyone to get into formation and promised they'd show their enemies what Real's suffering looked like. Then, with a shout, he ordered the advance, sending the army charging forward. Across the field, an enemy orc sneered and called them idiots just as a massive explosion erupted behind Vandal's troops, blasting orcs into the air. Shocked, Vandal demanded to know what had just hit them, only to see a gigantic swamp mammoth hulking behind the enemy line. The beast unleashed another barrage, explosions tearing across the field and throwing soldiers like ragdolls. Shutra and Karak stared wide-eyed, and Shutra muttered that they'd walked straight into a trap and that the enemy must have seen through their entire plan from the start. The enemy forces began pushing Vandal's troops back, blades clashing nonstop as both sides struggled for control. The swamp mammoth loomed in the distance, far bigger and far deadlier than any normal mammoth, a true monster built for war. Shutra stood frozen for a moment, trying to figure out what to do, when a heavy stomp echoed behind him. Lizard-like warriors suddenly rushed out, joining the green orcs on the battlefield, and Shutra was stunned to see the lizard men entering the fight as well. One of them lunged straight at him, but Karak darted in and cut it down before it could reach him. Karak yelled at Shutra to wake up, warning that one slip-up would get them all killed, and Shutra nodded, admitting that Karak was right and reminding himself this wasn't some game. Meanwhile, Chris fought furiously against a swarm of enemies, furious that their entire plan had been exposed and that the enemy was clearly playing with them. Caitlin shouted for him, telling him they needed to fall back and wait for a better chance. And Chris was shocked she'd say that. He argued that if they were treated poorly, they could take even heavier losses, maybe even get wiped out, but Caitlin insisted that staying would only increase the number of deaths. She pressed him to choose, saying now was the moment to pull back, and Chris clenched his jaw, finally shouting the order to retreat. He commanded the magic users to set up a shield line in the rear to stall the enemy, while the others regrouped and withdrew. Then he roared for everyone to survive and make it back alive, reminding them they were not allowed to die here. Soon after, a small camp was set up, and injured orcs lay scattered around while healers worked on their wounds. Chris sat with a heavy expression, admitting that he had grown careless and should have questioned things sooner, even a little. Vandal replied that what was done, and now their only choices were to pull the army back completely or ask the Demon King's castle for reinforcements. Chris agreed, saying he couldn't throw his soldiers into a death trap just to chase some foolish idea of glory. As he prepared to give the order, Felicia suddenly raised her hand and said she had a proposal. She explained that the reason she came to this region in the first place was to investigate an ancient ruin located at the edge of the Jishuka Mountains. Shutra, listening closely, remembered that Felicia was a brilliant mage, but even in Knight Saga, her skills leaned heavily towards study and exploration rather than combat. Felicia spread out a map on the table and continued, saying she had been researching a legendary ruin hidden in these mountains for a long time. The 1,500-year-old lair of the earth dragon Enkidu. Enkidu, a dragon born from molten rock, had filled its lair with guardians to protect its horde. Among those protectors were the dwarves who once lived in the Jishuka Mountains, and Enkidu had ordered them to forge special weapons to defend the lair. Chris leaned forward and asked her what kind of weapons she was talking about. Felicia explained that the treasure was the thunder-birthing anvil, a relic that could command the chimeras guarding the ruin and unleash magic powerful enough to affect an entire army. Then she slapped her palm on the table and declared that finding it was their only real chance of winning. She reminded them that this was the whole reason she came here, but when Vandal asked if she knew the anvil's exact location, she admitted she didn't, and that this fragment of information was all she had. Chris sighed that this wasn't helpful at all, pointing out that they had no idea when the enemy would attack again, and he couldn't gamble everyone's lives on a treasure hunt. Felicia scowled at his response, but before she could argue, Shutra stepped forward and said with confidence that the thunder-birthing anvil was definitely in these mountains, which left Felicia surprised he was defending her. Shutra remembered seeing the anvil during his time playing as the hero Loch, and added that he found a connected tale while studying the Dwarven language, finishing by saying that he trusted Felicia completely, which stunned her even more as he privately thought he might as well earn some extra favor. Chris cut in again, saying this wasn't about trust and that wasting time would get them all killed, and Shutra clenched his teeth, irritated at how stubborn Chris was being. Shutra refused to back down, so he pointed at the map and said the Garner people had a similar tale, adding that the entrance to the ruins had to be close and that if they let him search the area, he was sure he could find it. He promised that if he failed, he would take all the blame, asking everyone to trust him just this one time. Soon after, phantom steeds summoned by Felicia glided through the sky with Shutra and the others riding on their backs. Shutra silently celebrated finally getting everyone to move toward the anvil. But his thoughts were cut short when Karak yelled for him to hold on or risk falling. And Shutra agreed, even though he knew he'd be fine since he rode these creatures constantly as Zephyr. He checked his map and figured they'd reach the entrance in about an hour. And with the minimap, locating the ruins wouldn't be difficult, though leading the group there naturally was the real challenge. Shutra mulled over the problem and told himself he had 1 hour to come up with a plan and that things would probably work out somehow. A short while later, Shutra was spouting fancy terms and making up complicated explanations about how he could pinpoint the anvil's location. And when he finished, he quietly wondered if any of that actually convinced them. Karak and Caitlin stared at him, completely puzzled, and the others also asked what his explanation was even supposed to mean. Shutra, looking stressed, thought to himself that they should just ignore the parts he bluffed through. Then Felicia suddenly told him to take the lead, shocking Shutra because she didn't question him at all. She added that she understood his reasoning and urged him to guide them, leaving Shutra wondering if the nonsense he made up somehow sounded believable. He stepped forward and told them to follow, though Felicia kept watching him with narrowed eyes. After a bit of walking, Karak spoke up, saying they had followed the prince all this way only to end up at a plain cliff wall. He asked Shutra if he was sure this was the right place, because it definitely didn't look like an entrance. Shutra simply smiled and said he never mentioned going to the entrance in the first place, leaving Karak even more confused. Shutra then turned to Caitlin and asked if she could break this spot open, and Caitlin pointed at herself, asking if he really meant her. Shutra nodded and said he was relying on her for something big. Although uncertain, Caitlin agreed to try, while Felicia looked at Shutra in disbelief and asked if the anvil that births thunder was actually hidden inside this cliff. Shutra then explained with confidence that based on his calculations, breaking through this spot would let them skip all the dungeon guardians, so if Caitlin could just smash the wall. Only for Felicia to interrupt and demand how he expected Caitlin to punch through solid stone, asking if Shutra thought she was some sort of living siege engine. Shutra awkwardly asked how else they were supposed to open it, and Felicia gathered mana in her hand with a smug smile, saying that any proper ruin explorer carries a secondary specialty in blowing things up, proudly referring to herself. She then unleashed a massive blast, the cliff shaking as cracks spread, and the wall slowly collapsed while everyone stared in awe. Felicia herself was stunned, unable to believe they actually found the place so easily. When they stepped inside, Caitlin pointed at the half-dome structure and asked if that was where the thunder thingy was kept, and Shutra confirmed it, adding that the dome was probably the final layer of protection and the anvil was stored within. Karak suggested just breaking it open, but Shutra refused, saying that forcing it might damage the anvil and there had to be a proper mechanism to unlock it. Meanwhile, Felicia was watching Shutra with suspicion, then glanced around and pointed out a strange detail. Among the 9 statues, 3 held weapons while 6 had empty hands. Caitlin agreed and guessed that maybe they needed to arm the rest, but Felicia said it wouldn't be that easy. She added that the weapons the statues were holding were clearly dwarven-made, so the other statues would probably require dwarven weapons as well. Hearing that, Caitlin asked how they were supposed to get weapons like those in the first place. Shutra suddenly spoke up and said he actually had 6 of those weapons on him, leaving Felicia stunned. He thought to himself that he couldn't use them before because his level had been too low, so he tossed them into his inventory and never imagined they would be useful now, feeling oddly lucky about it. Shutra then casually added that he had also brought the weapons he picked up during their last tunnel mission as spares, and Karak demanded to know since when and how on earth the prince was carrying 6 heavy weapons in a tiny bag. Shutra groaned inwardly, annoyed that Karak's instincts were always sharp at the wrong time. So he laughed awkwardly and told everyone to stop asking questions and just grab the weapons before they wasted any more time. A short while later, once all 6 statues were armed, their eyes lit up, glowing bright blue as the ground trembled and the half-dome began to open. Everyone stared in shock, and as they looked down into the chamber, Shutra felt his breath catch. The legendary anvil that gives birth to thunder was right there before them. Felicia quickly raised her voice and told everyone to hold on because, according to the records, there was still one last step required to fully activate it, leaving Shutra confused. Felicia then explained that Shutra and Karak needed to stay exactly where they were, while the others had to move to the 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock positions on the circular platform. From this point on, they were to pour mana into the disc, starting with Felicia and moving clockwise, each person increasing the amount bit by bit. Once everyone took their positions, Felicia activated her magic and told them all to stay sharp because they were about to begin. One by one, everyone channeled their power toward the anvil, and Felicia called out to Shutra, telling him to push harder and keep his mana steady, warning him not to lose focus. Shutra struggled but managed to hold his ground, and just when it seemed like they were in sync, a massive blast erupted and the world around him vanished. Shutra suddenly found himself in a completely different place, staring in confusion as an enormous army gathered before him, and he wondered what he was looking at. A deep voice echoed through the air, commanding its followers to listen, and when Shutra turned his gaze upward, he froze in shock as a gigantic black dragon hovered high above. With a thunderous roar, the dragon ordered the assembled forces to guard the sacred nest of the great Enkidu and become the barrier between the demon realm and the human realm. But the moment those words rang out, Shutra jolted awake, gasping for air as he lay on the floor. Seeing the dragon in his mind again, he realized with certainty that the creature had to be the black dragon, none other than the earth dragon, Enkidu.